August of 1945. It was with shaky hands that Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka brought a metal cup to his lips, expecting to taste poison. However, instead, he tasted something that was completely foreign to him. There is a delicious and bubbly liquid that rushes through him like lightning in liquid form. Across the Nevada sun-baked camp, American guards throw hamburgers that have only been partially consumed into garbage cans without giving them a second thought. Tanaka sheds tears, not because she is harsh, but because she had a knowledge that was more dreadful than death. A single grain of rice was the source of conflict between troops in Japan. There, millions of bottles of Coca-Cola were being sold, while tons of beef were being heaped up. In American camps, why did Japanese propaganda staff members cry over hamburgers and soda? Mainly due to the fact that what they seen foretold the destruction of their country's military strategy and the beginning of a global culture that they were not yet able to grasp. When did a taste become a defining moment in your life? Now is the time to begin answering questions. Despite the fact that the captives of Camp 371 were unable to speak, the numbers spoke a tale. The new recruits were inspected for their health by the United States Army doctors on the second morning of their arrival. While holding a clipboard, scales were placed on the gravel. Everyone in the group took a step forward, their boots scuffing the earth as they did so. The medical professionals took weights, measured the length of the arms, and looked for indications of malnutrition. The statistics were surprising to the majority of people. A close contact between the bones and the skin. The average body mass is about 20% lower than the norms in the United States. The intake ledger for the month of August 1945 at the camp reveals a trend. The Japanese PS gained an average of 3% of their body weight in just 2 weeks. At the time of his arrival, Private Minor Kia weighed 108 pounds. Nevertheless, her weight increased to 115 pounds just 14 days later. One of the words that was written on his card with a red pencil was, "Digestive reacclimatization complete." These data were compared by the physicians to the number of German prisoners that were taken in during the previous month. Nobody had reached such a rapid level of success. It is impossible to overstate how striking the contrast is. During her time in Japan, Kia had subsisted on millet flour and rainwater, surviving on a daily calorie intake of less than 100 to 200. A daily allotment of more than 3,800 calories was provided here. A bottle of Coca-Cola, white bread, beef stew, and mashed potatoes, and a bottle of Coca-Cola. The inspection tallies for the month of September show that Sergeant Hajime Makondo and Private First Class Kenji Yamada both had comparable increases. There was a gain of 7 or perhaps 9 pounds in the first 2 weeks. In his report, the observer from the Red Cross, Dr. Hans Keller, identified a discernible improvement in the individual's physical condition. Apparently, PS is perplexed by the abundance. In one of the entries in the camp log, there is a description of a group of inmates gathered around the kitchen window, peering at trays of bread that had not been eaten and were planned to be thrown away. The figures that were printed on the health cards were accurate. Within a matter of days, the memory of famine was replaced with the peculiar discomfort of suddenly having an abundance of food. On the other hand, this tale is not only about weight. The data sheets of the camp, which were loaded with figures and check marks, barely recorded the surface of the situation. As the scales shifted from hunger to something that was far more difficult to comprehend, the true effect was taking place in the minds of each individual guy. Sergeant Hajime Kondo gazed down at the tray that he was holding, which had mashed potatoes and a thick piece of meat. Steam was rising from the contents of the tray. Unconcerned, he halted and cast a glance over his shoulder to the American guards who were standing there conversing and smiling. In Burma, Kondo had consumed very little food other than grain that had been cooked and bits of root. His nose were now filled with the aroma of piping hot steak and white bread, yet he felt a tightening in his gut due to his suspicions. The mesol was filled with quiet sounds buzzing about him, with some guys conversing and others remaining silent with their eyes wide open. On the other side of him, Private Kenji Yamada was sitting and picking at a hamburger patty, which was the very first one he had ever seen. With apprehension, Yamada pushed his hands into the soft bun, unsure of whether he should consume it or conceal it. Sluggishly, the initial nibbles were taken. The outcome was the same regardless of whether the convicts nibbled or pushed themselves to swallow mouthfuls. Within a half an hour, the hospital at the camp was completely full. A total of 36 guys reported experiencing abrupt nausea and cramping on the very first day. The most prevalent ailment, according to the medical logs from the 15th of August in 1945, was severe vomiting, followed by nutritional shock. Kondo rolled over onto his back behind the barracks and writhed in agony until his legs began to shake. In front of the camp nurse, Yamada, who was pale and sweating, said that he was afraid that the meal had been tainted with poison. His statements were mirrored by other men, the majority of whom had been instructed to anticipate death rather than pity from their prisoners. There is a description of the misunderstanding in the camp newsletters from that week. A dread of chemical additions is the reason Japanese inmates refuse to eat their food. In the camp file, the OSS notes say that there are rumors that are circulating among the new arrivals. Some individuals were under the impression that they were being induced to gain weight for the purpose of conducting medical studies. The topic of cannibalism was discussed by others. Even though they were perplexed, the guards attempted to comfort them by eating from the same trays. However, distrust continued to exist. The kitchen workers reported record amounts of unused bread and steak scraped into garbage bins over the course of many days, and trays returned with only half of their contents consumed. It is impossible to overstate how striking the contrast is. Kondo had gotten into a fight in Japan over a handful of beans at one point. During this time, he observed a security guard throw away a cheeseburger after only 2 bites. The figures that were recorded in the medical ledger of the camp only conveyed a portion of the tale. The expressions of guys who had lived as a result of hope and hunger were the ones who revealed the actual shock. They were now confronted with a world in which there was a plenty of food, but there was a scarcity of trust. A total of 5 refrigerated train cars, each containing 40,000 pounds of beef, arrived at the siding of Camp Shelby in the month of June in 1944. According to the quartermasters, who signed off on the manifest with a mechanical pencil and a shake of the head, the numbers were so shocking that they stunned them. The position of butcher was assigned to Corporal Akira Okimoto, who worked in the kitchens of the camp. His directive is to prepare 2,000 pounds of beef each and every week for the P complex on its own. Okimoto has never before saw such a large quantity of meat in a single location. The storm continued to be chilly and buzzing, and it was filled with beef sides that were heaped on metal hooks. The air was pungent with the aroma of animal fat and ice. Sharpening knives and getting the day's work underway was something that Okimoto and his staff did every morning. Meats such as steaks, roasts, and ground hamburger were cut into smaller pieces, as many as hundreds of patties at once. As if it were a ledger of excess, the kitchen logs from the month of June read, "Hashing, beef stew, and roast brisket are all served in trays. The amount is sufficient to serve each prisoner twice again." The greatest surprise, however, was the amount of garbage. Audits conducted in the kitchen over that summer revealed that up to 300 pounds of meat was discarded per week. The fat, the gristle, and the sections that were not eaten were scraped directly into the bins. Guards who were stressed for time or hunger threw out steaks that were only partially consumed and passed over burgers. A careless flick of the wrist that results in food being thrown away by accident. In a place where a piece of dried fish may be enough to provide a family's meal, Okimoto, who had been reared in such environment, observed in quiet as the garbage accumulated. In his journal, Private Shiro Abe composed the following: "In Japan, rice was a fortune and beans were a luxury. In this region, the U.S. population feeds meat with both hands and discards the remaining flesh." It is impossible to overstate how striking the contrast is. Inspecting staff from the Red Cross made note of the abundance, noting on the fact that the mess ran out and the stores never emptied. For the inmates, the mound of flesh represented more than simply a source of sustenance. There was evidence, both apparent and indisputable, that the United States dominance extended beyond its arsenal of weapons. The carving and subsequent discarding of this item served as a daily reminder of a society in which supply lines were never interrupted, and starvation was a choice. A subdued handover of the script took place at Camp Shelby. passed from one hand to another as if it were a secret. Every prisoner was given coupons that were worth up to 80 cents a day, but they were not paid out in actual currency. These let guys to go to the PX, which was a squat facility that had been whitewashed and was located behind the meal hall, and purchase some little comforts. There are chocolate bars, cigarettes, and even a bottle of Coca-Cola that are sometimes found. The canteen ledger for the month of August 1944 is a narrative in and of itself. During the course of a single month, 1,340 chocolate bars were sold, in addition to hundreds of drinks and cans of fruit. When males who had previously counted individual beans were given the opportunity to select a reward, it felt nearly unbelievable to them. A single scoop of vanilla ice cream was the first thing that Sergeant Katsuya Mori, a former educator from Saitama, purchased with his first paycheck. As he sat on the wooden bench outside the PX, the Mississippi sun pushed down at a temperature of 100 degrees, beads of perspiration forming on his forehead. After some time had passed, he wrote a letter to his family that was never sent out. My teeth were achy from the cold. I detected a mix of salt and sweetness. When I thought of the rice cakes that my mother made, I felt like crying. The pages of Private Shiro Abie's diary, which have become brittle with age, contain a record of the first time that the PX brought Coca-Cola on ice. An old, rusted metal cooler that was stuffed with bottles was brought out by the personnel of the camp. Scripts in hand, prisoners lined up, unsure of whether or not they should put their faith in the bubbling dark liquid. As Abe watched, the guards engaged in a toast by clinking their bottles together and taking lengthy, irresponsible swigs of their beverages. When he was in Japan, he wrote, "We called it a feast and drank water that had been boiled. In this place, even the inmates drink like they are kings." The majority of men did not spend their wages on sweets. The purchase of soap or writing paper, which are both little reminders of dignity, was something that some people did. On the other side, the ice cream days, in which the PX distributed cones to the public during a hot, became legendary. As they peered over the fence, men licked the vanilla that was melting off their fingers and stared in silence, each of them lost in memories. It is impossible to overstate how striking the contrast is. The camps used coins and calories as the primary units of measurement for plenty. The inmates, for the very first time, used their own agency in order to purchase a taste of comfort, despite the fact that the outside world continued to be hungry. As they traveled across the Midwest, freight trains carrying empty glass bottles and syrup tanks rumbled over the tracks. These trains were en route to Army depots and P camps. The transport manifest for the quarterm that was issued in August 1945 at Camp McCoy has a listing of 2 complete train carriages that were designated for Coca-Cola supplies. Priority space is often reserved for the storage of medical supplies or munitions. The syrup was delivered in drums of 55 gallons, each of which was labeled with the well-known red lettering. These barrels were then housed in lock sheds located behind the mess hall. Even though it was late summer, the bottles remained cool because to the ice blocks that had been chipped off the large shipment. Photographs of the offloading were taken by Swiss Red Cross inspectors who were visiting during that month. Railway workers in the United States wearing canvas overalls pull cartons off of flat wagons as security personnel verify the documentation. In one of the pictures, there is a line of convicts wearing clothes that have been discolored from the sun, watching as the bottles are placed on wooden pallets. It was reported in the inspector's report that was sent to Geneva that the scene was of an industrial magnitude, with provisions that were sufficient for thousands. The wartime contract that Coca-Cola had guaranteed supply to every army base that included prisoners of war at the time, and the numbers were startling. During the year 1945 alone, the firm manufactured more than 5 billion bottles for use in the military. 2 bottles were provided to each Japanese prisoner at Camp McCoy on a weekly basis, according to the records, and additional bottles were available for purchase at the canteen. It was impossible for the convicts to comprehend the magnitude of the logistics involved in this operation. It was common for supply trains in Japan to transport either barrels of pickled radish or sacks of rice. Rarely a luxury, and never in such a large quantity. The arrival of soda was as certain as the arrival of boots or firearms in this location. Not only was the abundance obvious in the mess hall, but it was also incorporated into the railroads and schedules of a whole continent. Lieutenant Masao Nakamura was seated on the edge of his bunk, with a bottle of Coca-Cola poised between his legs. He spun it gently while examining the engraved letters and used his thumb to trace the curvature of the glass. Already the cap had been removed. To serve as proof, he kept it hidden away in his journal and pressed it flat. When Nakamura had his first drink, he was rendered speechless. With a sweetness that was more intense than any fruit he had ever tasted, his teeth began to hurt. He added, "I drank a bottle of American sugar," on the postcard that he sent home without any restrictions. There is still a memory in my tongue. The sugar cubes that would be required to equal one bottle were being counted by Sergeant Kenji Awaz, who was located across the barracks. At least 10, which is more than his family received in a single month, was his estimation. It was difficult to accept that the drink was characterized as a festival in the mouth in the letter that I wrote, which was seized by censors. Through the process of folding the label into a paper crane, he created a memento from a time where sweetness was measured in grains rather than spoonfuls. Captain Takashi, who was far older than the majority of the troops, observed the younger men as they marveled. In Japan, he had assigned each member of his unit a solitary orange as a ration. At this location, he witnessed persons trading bottle tops like currency, with each cap being a minor prize. The following is an excerpt from Ito's journal entry dated September 3, 1945. "They waste nothing here, yet they have too much. I feel terrible that I am envious of my captors. The fact that the bottle caps were stacked in drawers and pockets was evidence of a new mathematical method. With each cap came a taste of sugar and a memory that was etched into the metal. When it came to Coca-Cola, the figures that Nakamura and Iwase were working with were more than just statistics. All of the things that they had previously thought about power, scarcity, and the significance of triumph were called into question by them. It was before daylight when a quiet standoff started at Camp Livingston in the month of March in 1944. There were 55 Japanese inmates who, under the command of Sergeant Yasuo Sato, moved their breakfast plates aside and put their arms over their chests instead. Not a single grain of rice or piece of bread made its way out of the kitchen and onto their tables for a period of 3 days. During the strike, a former railway clerk from Yokohama, carried a notebook that he concealed beneath his mattress. In it, he recorded each hour of the strike. "If we eat, we betray our homeland," he wrote in his manuscript. "It is possible that we may perish as men if we do not comply." While they waited, the guards anticipated either violence or collapse. However, the hunger strike did not develop into a riot at any point. Monitoring personnel from the Swiss Red Cross who were present during the inspection documented the occurrence in their report. "We do not require any force feeding. A medical team is on high alert. However, there is no hostility displayed by the prisoners." After the third night, the men in the barracks began to discuss the patience of the guard, the undisturbed food that was building up in the mess hall, and the lack of discipline that was being administered. A few of the detainees started to show signs of weakness. At the beginning of the following morning, Sarto observed the youngest member of his group reaching for a slice of bread. The hands were shaking. The strike was carried out in a calm manner, not out of rebellion, but rather out of fatigue, and the eerie aroma of freshly cooked stew that was being carried through the air. When Sarto was in Japan, he witnessed people passing away due to a lack of food. Not because of a threat, but rather because of the weight of an excessive amount of food. Resistance ended here. When confronted with wealth, the collective will that had endured being on the battlefield and traveling across oceans dissipated out of existence. There was complete silence over the mess hall throughout the steak night at Camp Livingston. The supper that Lieutenant Kazuo Sakamaki had prepared was still unfinished when he sat at the end of a large oak table. On the dish that was in front of him was a big slab of meat that was pink in the middle. Mashed potatoes and a wedge of pie were also on the platter. The weight of anticipation was weighing down on the other convicts around him to the point that they were picking at their meals in silence. This caused Sakamaki's hands to shake as he held his fork in his palms. Over the course of his life, he had subsisted on rice balls and salty water, and he had never imagined a supper like this. Notations were taken for file number 2234 by OSS observers who were stationed nearby. One wrote in pencil, "Subject does not eat, appears withdrawn. Eyes fixed on plate." As soon as the supper was over, Sakamaki made his way back to the barracks. On the 17th of March, 1944, the hospital log has an entry that was made late at night. A patient who was nonverbal and had lacerations on their left wrist was treated and bandaged. Years later, when a nurse recalled the event, she noted the blood that was on his uniform as well as the blank face that he had. In his diary, which was subsequently found by camp personnel, Sakamaki had written, "If kindness is the weapon, I am already defeated." Sakamaki did not leave a letter, but his journal was eventually retrieved. Sakamaki's dreams were nightmares of home, of duty, and of a world that was flipped upside down by a single meal, according to a subsequent writing by Major Hideo Iwakuro, who shared the barracks with Sakamaki that night. It is impossible to overstate how striking the contrast is. The only way to avoid being looked down upon in Japan was to pass away. At this location, a steak meal was sufficient to unravel the soul of a man. By the year 1945, American companies were manufacturing 5 billion bottles of Coca-Cola annually. At the same time, Japanese prisoners of war in camps like as Shelby and Livingston were given up to 3,800 calories per day, which was more than 3 times the amount of calories that some of them had been given throughout the war in Japan. Both the testimonials and the camp records of the captives, such as Hiroshi Tanaka, who went from being hungry to being in excess overnight, describe the shock and relief that this brought him. Nevertheless, not every personal story is preserved. It is still the case that public archives do not include a great number of names and comprehensive reports, and that certain camp files are either classified or missing. The overwhelming magnitude of American supply networks and everyday luxury highlighted a gap not only in terms of resources, but also in terms of understanding the world. This is something that is unmistakable. Following the war, Japan saw a significant shift, which was marked by the quick adoption of American corporate practices and the growth of fast food franchises, such as McDonald's in Tokyo. In modern times, hamburgers and Coca-Cola have become commonplace in Japan. There is evidence that the abundance that was seen in early pea camps represented the beginning of a new age, a reverberation of the tale that started with Tanaka's hands shaking, and that first taste in the Nevada heat can now be heard in every glass bottle and brilliantly lighted burger establishment in modern Japan. Thank you.